Spring 2009, on the shore of Lake Carvey in New Zealand's Waikato lowlands, a truck backs down to the water, carrying a cooler holding 200 dung beetles, and 50 feet up the ridge sits $50 million of dead machinery that never cleaned a drop. Subscribe for more wildlife comeback stories. There are more of these than you'd believe. Look up at that ridge and you'll see the graveyard of a very expensive idea. Floating pumps, switched off. Filtration barges, dead in the water. A dredger the size of a bus, silent. Its arm frozen mid-swing. For 11 years, the engineers had fought the algae here. They pumped, they filtered, they scraped the bottom. And after 11 years, the water still looked exactly like this, thick, opaque, the color of pea soup, so green you couldn't see your own hand a foot below the surface. Now, the money, the official rescue budget for Lake Carvey came to $50 million. The beetle release cost roughly $4,000. And here's the thing that makes this story so strange. Every single model said those beetles were irrelevant, a fringe experiment, a side project out on the cattle pastures with nothing whatsoever to do with the lake. The water was the problem, everyone agreed. The beetles were a footnote, except the footnote is the reason you're watching this. What those 200 insects did to Lake Carvey is what a limnologist named Dr. Ellen Marsh, someone who has spent her whole life measuring dying water, still calls, and I'm quoting her, the most humbling result of my career. She had the equations, she had the barges. She watched a plastic cooler undo everything she thought she knew. I'm Peter, and this is the full story of how 200 beetles cleaned a lake. The best machines money could buy could not. Picture that ridge for a second. $50 million of steel and a plastic cooler. One of those two things worked, and it wasn't the one you'd bet on. We're going to walk through the whole thing, how the lake collapsed, how the multi-million-dollar rescue failed, the one strange biological mechanism the engineers overlooked completely, and the small detail that outlasted every machine on that hill. But before any of that, you have to understand what a dung beetle actually is, because I promise you, it isn't what you're picturing. You're picturing a passenger, a little creature that lives in a landscape, rolls its ball of dung, and gets on with its small life. That's wrong. A dung beetle is a plumber. It moves the entire nutrient system of the land it lives on, pulls it, buries it, redirects it, decides where the richness of a whole catchment ends up. It plumbs the ground beneath a farm, the way pipes plumb a house. And for decades, right across those Waikato hills, almost nobody was watching it do the single most important job on the property. So hold on to that number $4,000, because it's about to embarrass $50 million. Not with a machine, not with a clever new filter, with an insect that fits in the palm of a gloved hand, doing something so simple that once you see it, you'll wonder how an entire industry of engineers missed it for 11 years. And to understand how the beetles did it, you first have to understand how Lake Carvey died. Because here's the part that changes everything. The lake didn't die in the water. It died on the hills above it. Slowly, invisibly, one cow patty at a time, 40,000 of them every single day. That's where the poison came from, and that's where the machines never once thought to look. The kitchen that was feeding the algae wasn't in the lake at all. 40,000 of them every single day. 40,000 of them every single day. By 2001, more than 40,000 cattle graze the catchment above Lake Carvey, and each cow drops around 12 patties a day, that dung baked on the surface and washed downhill with every rain. That is how the lake died, not in the water, but on the hills above it. It didn't happen overnight. Through the 80s and 90s, dairy spread across the Waikato lowlands, the way water finds the low ground, steadily, quietly, filling every green fold of the catchment. More paddocks, more herds, more waste, and every patty that sat there in the sun was a small parcel of phosphorus and nitrogen, waiting for rain. Then the rain came. It always comes. And it lifted those nutrients off the grass and ran them straight down into Kavi. Pour that much fertilizer into a lake year after year, and the lake answers. The algae bloomed. Great green blankets of it, spreading across the surface, drinking the sunlight, and then rotting and pulling the oxygen out of the water beneath. The eels went first, then the trout, turning in the shallows, gasping in water that could no longer hold a breath. By the mid-2000s, the lake ran the color of pea soup, thick and still. And this is where the money arrived. 11 years of it. $50 million of pumps, filters, a dredger the size of a bus. All of it built to do one thing. Pull the nutrients back out of the water. Strip the phosphorus. Strip the nitrogen. Clean what was already dirty. It was the obvious plan. It was also, we now know, the wrong one. Here's the part that genuinely unsettled the engineers. The lake's food supply wasn't in the lake. Every machine they switched on was fighting the symptom. The algae was fed from somewhere else entirely, and no amount of dredging touched the source. You can bail a boat all day. If the hole's still open, you're just buying time. So where was the hole? Here's the part most people have never heard, and it has a name so dull it hides how strange it is. Nutrient interception. Stay with me, because it's simple. Dung sits on the surface of a paddock. Rain hits it, strips it, carries the phosphorus and nitrogen downhill into the water. That's the loop. Cow, patty, rain, lake, over and over, 40,000 animals feeding it every day. A runoff loop. The lake had a kitchen, and the kitchen was up on the hills. Now here is what a dung beetle does. It finds that patty within hours. It rolls it, breaks it, and drags it down, burying the dung up to half a meter within 48 hours. Underground, before the next rain can find it. And down there, the nutrients don't run anywhere. They feed the grass roots, they feed the soil. The phosphorus that would have gone to the algae goes to the pasture instead. The beetle breaks the loop, not by cleaning the water, by making sure the food never reaches the water at all. Think about where the problem actually lived. Not the water you're picturing, the grass on the hill above it. Nobody had modeled the pastures as the lake's kitchen. Every equation looked down at the water. The answer was up on the slopes, threaded through dark soil, where nobody was watching. Cut the food at the source, and the lake starves the algae itself. No machine required. The simple lever wasn't in the water at all. It was in the soil, and it had 6 legs. So in 2009, they didn't build anything bigger. No new barge, no stronger pump. They loaded a cooler with beetles, drove down to the pasture, and tipped them out onto the grass. Then they got out of the way. So, in 2009, they tipped 200 beetles onto the pasture, and everyone waited. The first season, nothing happened at all. No clearer water, no change, and the engineers on the ridge allowed themselves a thin smile. And then the counting started. That first empty season, when nothing happened, turned out to be the beetles digging in, not sleeping, working. Down in the dark, one buried patty at a time, quietly rewiring the whole plumbing of the land, while the engineers on the ridge weren't looking. By 2013, the colony had spread across 9,000 hectares of pasture. That's 90 square kilometers of hillside, and under nearly every fresh cowpat, a beetle carrying the nutrients down before the rain could ever reach them. The runoff loop that had fed the lake for 30 years was breaking, patch by patch, farm by farm. Then came the number that ended the argument. A 2015 survey measured the phosphorus washing into Kavi and compared it to the years before the release. It had dropped by 62%. Read that again, 62%. From beetles, not from the pumps, not from the dredger the size of a bus, not from a single one of the $50 million of machinery, from an insect that costs less than a cup of coffee, and the water answered. It cleared from the edges inward first, the reedy shallows, where the pea soup green thinned to something you could see your hand through. Then, further out, week by week, the murk retreating toward the middle, like a tide going out. People who'd grown up on that shore said they'd forgotten the lake even had a bottom. Then, the living things came back on their own. A 2017 paper, catchment-wide, recorded native eels returning to the spawning shallows they'd abandoned a generation before. Nobody carried them there. They simply arrived, nosing into water that finally held enough oxygen to breathe. And over the reeds, dragonflies, no one had released, no one had planned for, glinting above a lake that 11 years of engineering had left for dead. That's the whole thing, right there. The machines couldn't. The beetles did. A lake that $50 million could not clean was healing itself, quietly, on $4,000 of insects, and the patience to leave them alone. But I want to be honest about what this does not solve. Because if I stopped there, I'd be selling you a fairy tale, and this isn't one. The beetles cut the food supply at the source. They cannot touch a bloom that's already floating in the water. Once the algae's in the lake, it's in the lake. The beetles struggle through wet winters, when the soil turns to soup and the burying slows to almost nothing. And in the parts of the catchment where the cattle numbers stayed too high, where the dung came faster than the beetles could ever bury it, the loop simply outran them. The water there stayed green. This isn't a magic switch. It's a slow lever, and it only works if you don't overload it. Get greedy, and the whole thing tips back. Still, something small survived all of it, and it isn't the machinery. There's an information sign on the shore of Carvey now, the kind you'd walk straight past. And painted on it is the local Maori word for the beetle, a word that had very nearly slipped out of memory, spoken by almost no one, carried by almost nobody. It's back. School children learn it on the shoreline. It's the small thing that outlasted the machines. The pumps rusted on the ridge. The dredger sits where they switched it off, orange with corrosion, half swallowed by grass. And down in the pasture, out of sight, the beetles are still working, still burying, still holding the lake's kitchen shut, one patty at a time, decades after the engineers went home. They aren't the cleanup crew here. They never were. They're the plumbing. Go back to where we started. A truck backing down to the water in the spring of 2009. A single cooler on the shoreline, small enough to carry in 2 hands and 200 beetles inside it. Everything that mattered was already in that cooler. We just spent $50 million looking in the wrong place in the water when the answer was in the soil, and it had 6 legs. That, to me, is the heart of it. Nature was never waiting for our machines. It was waiting for us to stop fighting it and get out of the way. Tell me in the comments which comeback I should tell next, and subscribe. There are more of these than you'd believe. Thanks for watching.